Can our thoughts affect our physical reality? This idea, if it is true, has drastic implications about our understanding of the nature of reality and specifically our relationship to reality. We live within a society that is dominated by the materialistic paradigm, a paradigm in which every cause is boiled down to physical processes. And so from that perspective, the idea that our thoughts, which are seemingly these non-physical or metaphysical things, could have some influence over reality, seems like nothing more than wishful thinking. And yet, there are many reasons to believe that this might actually be the case. Hey everyone, my name's Georgia. I'm currently studying a master's degree in consciousness, spirituality and transpersonal psychology. And in my free time, I love to study the law of attraction and also anything about the nature of our reality. Now, in this video, I'm going to be diving into this question of whether or not our thoughts might actually have an effect on our physical reality. Now, I'm going to be looking at this from a scientific perspective and from a philosophical perspective. So we're going to be covering all bases. So firstly, I want to start by looking at this from a scientific perspective. So what are thoughts? From a scientific perspective, what are thoughts? So we all know what a thought feels like. We're all experiencing thousands and thousands of thoughts every single day. But what is actually happening in the brain when we're having those thoughts? Essentially, what's happening in the brain is an electrical process. What's happening when we're thinking is that electrical impulses are firing through our brain. So I'm not going to get right down into the chemistry of it, but essentially our brain is filled with billions of neurons and synapses, or I think it might even be trillions of synapses. And the way that these neurons communicate with each other is through an electrochemical process. So what's happening is we have these electrical impulses firing through our brain. So when we're thinking, there is basically electrical activity happening in our brain. Now, this electrical activity is what's measured on an EEG, and if you've seen an EEG, it'll show you these brainwave patterns. So these brainwave patterns are basically the patterns of this electrical activity, and this is what leads to the different types of brainwaves. So you have beta, alpha, theta, delta, there's also gamma. These are all different types of brainwaves that you can measure on an EEG that just basically correspond to the patterns of electrical activity that's happening in the brain. Now, based on the principles of electromagnetism, we know that any electric current is also accompanied by a magnetic field. So essentially the brain also produces its own magnetic field, and we know this because it can be measured by something called an MEG. So the brain produces electric currents which are accompanied by magnetic fields. So basically what this means is we know that the brain produces an electromagnetic field. Now this field does extend beyond the scalp, but it basically dissipates very quickly. So as soon as you get a few inches from the skull, then you can't really measure the field anymore. So it disappears quite quickly the further away you get from the skull. Now all of this activity that happens in the brain that I've just talked about basically comes from looking at thoughts from a physical perspective. But what we have to understand is all of this activity correlates to thoughts. To say that thoughts are nothing more than this physical activity, or that this physical activity is what produces thoughts, would be an assumption. We do not know that the physical activity is a cause of the thoughts. All we know is that there is a correlation between those things. Now, why do I say that? Because we can also look at thoughts from a metaphysical perspective. Now, we all know through our experience of thinking every day for our whole lives that there is a non-physical aspect to thoughts. We know that thoughts are correlated to this electrical activity in the brain, and yet the thoughts that we experience do not feel physical at all. They feel of a completely different nature of anything physical. Now, this is important because it hinges on what's called the hard problem of consciousness. Now, this problem is all about the difficulty of trying to explain consciousness in terms of physical processes. There is a very big gap between these physical processes happening in the brain, which we can boil down to atoms and subatomic particles. There's a very big gap from that to our conscious experience, including our thoughts, and no one has ever managed to bridge that gap. So basically we cannot claim that any type of brain activity is the cause of any type of mental activity. We know for a fact that they correlate, but we do not know that one is a cause of the other. Now, this is an important distinction to keep in mind, because when we look at thoughts from a physical perspective, this idea of our thoughts creating an electromagnetic field that doesn't go very far past our skull, that would imply that our thoughts don't have any effect on our physical reality, because this field really doesn't seem to do much, at least as far as we currently understand it. It doesn't seem to travel very much further than our brain at all. So looking at it from that perspective, it's very difficult to see how our thoughts could have any effect on physical reality. But when we take into account that our thoughts also have this metaphysical element to them, this element that seems non-physical, then we can acknowledge that we have a long way to go in understanding thoughts or consciousness in general. And because there is still this huge mystery there, it isn't that outlandish to at least explore the possibility that our thoughts may have some effect on physical reality that we just don't understand how yet. We don't understand the mechanism yet. And despite the materialistic understanding of thoughts providing no answer to how thoughts may affect physical reality, there is a lot of evidence out there that suggests that they might do just that. Now, the evidence that I'm talking about typically exists within the realm of psi phenomena or psychic phenomena. So examples of this would be telepathy, where you seem to be having the same thoughts as someone else, or you think of the same things. So many of us have had this experience where we'll be thinking of someone that we haven't spoke to in a long time, and then out of nowhere that person will suddenly contact you again, as if they somehow were connected to you, they somehow knew you were thinking about them, or there was at least both of you had this unconscious underlying connection. And we don't just have to rely on anecdotal evidence for these kind of experiences. One example you can look at is Rupert Sheldrake's work on the sense of being stared at. He's done loads of online experiments exploring this idea that people can actually sense when someone else is staring at them. And there was actually a meta-review done on all of the studies on psi phenomena. I'll put a picture of it here so you know what study that I'm talking about. And in that study they found that there was significant evidence for the reality of psi phenomena, and that couldn't be explained away by things such as selective reporting, the quality of the studies, and fraud, basically things like that. So the overall consensus of this meta-review was that the evidence out there for these psi phenomena is significant. So I think with all of this evidence out there, we have no choice but to explore the possibility that our thoughts can somehow extend beyond the brain and have an effect on our physical reality. Now, for someone like me who studies this stuff, this obviously is not difficult for me to do. I certainly have these kind of spiritual beliefs about reality. But from a materialistic standpoint, these kind of phenomena are often dismissed. So we have all of these phenomena that indicate that our mind can somehow operate beyond the skull or have some form of effect on our physical reality. Telepathy being one example where our mind seems to connect to someone else's. The sense of being stared at being another example where it seems like people can physically feel someone else's thoughts on them. So now I'm just going to go over 3 different theories which might help explain how our thoughts could have an effect on physical reality and how these different types of phenomena might be possible. So the first one that I want to mention is the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, which is an interpretation within quantum physics. Essentially, we have this problem in quantum physics whereby a particle exists as both a particle and a wave. And when the particle is in its wave form, it's in a superposition of states. It's in multiple states at the same time. Now, there is an experiment called the double slit experiment, and this experiment basically implies that when a particle is observed or measured, it collapses from being in that superposition of states to being in one finite state. It becomes one discrete particle. Now, this is called the measurement problem, and it's one of the biggest problems remaining in quantum physics. It's essentially the question of how or why would measurement or observation cause a wave that is essentially a superposition of lots of different states of a particle. Why would a measurement cause that to collapse into one discrete particle? Nobody knows the answer, but the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation suggests that consciousness is somehow causing this wave of potentiality to collapse into a physical particle. So according to this interpretation, our consciousness is actually shaping our physical reality. So it's not a huge leap from that interpretation to say that somehow our thoughts might have an effect on our physical reality. Now, the second theory that I want to talk about is Rupert Sheldrake's theory of extended mind. Now, in this theory, Rupert supposes that our mind or our thoughts actually physically extends beyond our skull and into the external environment. Now, he suggests that the way this happens is through morphic fields. Now, morphic fields are a part of another hypothesis that Rupert Sheldrake has called formative causation or morphic resonance. In that hypothesis, he proposes a new type of field called morphic fields, and these are in addition to the known fields of physics. These are essentially information fields that exist within and around different organisms and any self-organizing system. So Rupert basically suggests that through these morphic fields, our mind is able to extend beyond our brain and beyond our skull into our external environment. So he thinks that when it comes to phenomena such as the sense of being stared at, that people can pick up on that because the person who is doing the staring, their thoughts are physically extending beyond their skull and coming into contact with the person being stared at. So Rupert thinks the reason that we can sense it is because we are physically feeling that person's thoughts who are extending and touching us. Now, the third idea or theory that I want to consider is looking at the brain from a perspective of being interconnected with the quantum field. Now, I got this idea from a paper that I was reading, so I'll put the reference for that in the description in case you're interested. Now, essentially where this idea comes from is the fact that our brain is a physical thing that is made up of physical particles. And as I've already mentioned, there is a principle called wave-particle duality that applies to subatomic particles. Now, this principle essentially says that particles can exist as both a wave or an actual physical particle. So these quantum particles basically exist switching between these two different states, and when the particle is existing as a wave, it's basically interconnected with the whole quantum field. So if we look at the brain from this perspective, the brain being made up of all of these subatomic particles, we can say that the brain is in a sense interconnected with the quantum field. Now, the quantum field permeates all of reality, so when we look at the brain from this perspective, it implies that the brain isn't just some isolated entity that exists within our skulls, but instead it's connected to the fundamental fabric of our reality. Now, why is this significant? Because within quantum physics, there is this concept of non-locality, which doesn't apply to Newtonian physics, so it doesn't apply to this physical level that we exist at, it only applies at the quantum level. But essentially what the principle of non-locality is the fact that different quantum particles seem to have this non-local connection, so they seem to be connected in a way that is not bound by time and space. So this happens when you have one particle that you split into two different particles. These particles retain this underlying connection, and so the state of one particle is inherently linked to the state of the other particle, even though those particles are separated across space. Now, this principle is called quantum entanglement, and it suggests that two different particles can be instantaneously connected across very vast differences. Now, this is really fascinating to think about when we start again looking at the brain from a quantum perspective. Because when it comes to all these kind of psi phenomena, like the sense of being stared at or telepathy, it seems like there is some non-local connection happening. There is some kind of cause and effect happening that doesn't seem to be mediated by any kind of physical process that we know. Perhaps what's happening is we're tapping into the non-local aspect of reality. Information is being transferred between individuals without the need for any conventional physical process. Now, I don't know if this is true, of course, I don't know if any of these theories are true, but I think each of them provides a really interesting way of conceptualizing all of these different psi phenomena and providing different frameworks for how our thoughts might actually be able to affect our physical reality. Now, I think ultimately the evidence is there. These phenomena are obviously happening. So from my perspective, it really isn't a question of whether or not these things are happening. It's a question of how they are happening. And I hope this video provided some interesting ideas to help you conceptualize of the potential mechanisms underlying these different phenomena. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.